Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Opeth, finally. And the album is titled Pale Communion. You know, there are certain metal and rock bands that are pretty tricky to talk about, and you wouldn't think upon first glimpse that Opeth would fall underneath that banner. Beginning with some pretty well-received records in the 90s, they would eventually explode with a blend of progressive death and black metal in the late 90s and early 2000s. They're some of the most critically well-received metal records of the time, and they deserve the critical acclaim. Hell, I'd probably go on record as saying their 1999 release, Still Life, is their most fully formed, cohesive, memorable, and well-written release, even more than the critically beloved Blackwater Park or the twin releases of Damnation and Deliverance. And in my opinion, Still Life is an all-time favorite of mine, and one of the best albums of the 90s, hands down. But it was around that time, and especially among some of their following albums, that another figure comes into the spotlight. Producer, singer-songwriter, and frontman of progressive rock act Porcupine Tree, Steven Wilson. Now, I've gone on record calling Steven Wilson the prog metal Kanye West, and with Opeth, he found his Jay-Z. Because like it or not, Opeth's work became distinctly colored by tones that are instantly recognizable as Steven Wilson's, which shows an impressive, distinctive sound and incredible skill as a producer. But even on the albums that he did not produce for the band, his influence was definitely apparent. And as the 2000s wore on, Opeth began slowly moving away from the death and black metal of their roots and more towards their progressive side, which for me wasn't all that much of a problem. I mean, I love progressive rock and progressive metal, both in the aggressively visceral side from an act like Mastodon or the methodical brilliance of a band like Dream Theater. But at the same time, Opeth was one of the bands that maintained a stellar textured balance between death and black metal and their more folk-inspired progressive side, to the point where I would actually recommend Opeth as a good gateway from progressive metal into more extreme subgenres. And as much as I like prog rock, I'll admit to being a little bit disappointed to see some of that balance begin to drop away. In any case, after the excellent Ghost Reveries and the shakier but still good album Watershed, Opeth ditched death and black metal altogether for 2011's album Heritage. And it was pretty good, but not exactly great. Missing the loud, soft contrast between the heavier metal segments and the progressive rock left the album feeling a little bit lightweight and strangely empty, the latter being an issue of this mixing courtesy of Steven Wilson. And while I appreciate his commitment to musical dynamics, it probably wasn't the smartest decision on his part to say that the album was the first part of a trilogy encompassing his solo album, Grace for Drowning, and the self-titled Storm Corrosion debut album. Look, dude, I know you've collaborated with Opeth for years now, but isn't that a little bit presumptuous on your part? Now, the larger issue is that many of the songs felt very spacious, but lacking instrumentally and lyrically outside of the killer track Folklore, which I really did love. In other words, I gotta be honest, I wasn't really sure what to expect with Opeth's newest album, Pale Communion, but I steeled myself for the worst and I gave it many listens. And now, a month late, how's the album? You know what, man, I am really conflicted about this record, one of the reasons this review is so late. Because let me stress that Pale Communion by Opeth is a very good, possibly even great progressive rock album, full of instrumental elements and lyrical themes that are well executed and have some real nuance behind them, but there are so many little moments interspersed throughout this record that just frustrate me and take away from the overall experience of the album. It's definitely an album that requires more than a few listens to really sink in and process. Opeth had made the statement that they make difficult albums, and with this album, they weren't kidding. Yet at the same time, I would argue it's more immediately accessible and arguably a bit of a stronger record than Heritage. Heavier, a little bit more aggressive and immediate, and ultimately a more cohesive record, even if it does wear its influences on its sleeves a lot more prominently, and that means, to some extent, there aren't as many surprises. Now, this is where some of the more negative criticisms of this album have cropped up in comparison to the genre-bending musicianship that has defined some of Opeth's mid-period work. The influences on this album are much more apparent upon first listen. The symphonic touches and some of the strings on the latter half of the album, the bluesy sound of early Deep Purple, especially in the organ, which honestly I really liked, and particularly the odder tendencies and sonic palettes of the progressive rock acts like Goblin or even some Yes albums. In particular, there are some moments of rougher, almost southern rock tendencies that crop up in some of the more groove-heavy tracks like Cusp of Eternity and River, and the acoustic Elysian Elysian Woes. And like on all Opeth albums, there are some phenomenal moments where all the elements come together spectacularly and it's beautiful. I love the quiet guitar interlude on Eternal Rains Will Come that bursts into this interwoven textured riff with catchy as hell keyboard leads, an impressively intricate drum progression, and a rich backing chorus. It just sounded great. I also dug the borderline quirky guitar and bass leads on Goblin, the choral vocals against the well-picked guitar line, and one of the better solos on the album with River, and the fantastically thrilling strings arrangement on Voice of Treason, and to a lesser extent the more melancholy Faith in Others. Just fantastic strings on that. And it definitely helps that this album opts for a heavier, more dense mix that lends the tracks a lot of the gravitas that I really felt that Heritage lacked. But unfortunately, we still run into a few recurring issues from Heritage, namely in the production. And look, I like Steven Wilson as a producer. I've said this in the past. He's got a great natural grasp on guitar texture, his backing vocals add great atmosphere, a very distinctive atmosphere, and his strings production is superb. But just like on Heritage, the percussion and cymbals on this album feel a little bit too prominent and high up in the mix, and the vocals often feel a little bit too low, which can lead to some damn good songwriting getting lost in the shuffle. In fact, the vocal production all around is pretty hit and miss, especially when Michael's voice is placed with minimal accompaniment and it comes across as pretty small or lacking a fair amount of real impact. On the other hand, there are moments where he pushes his voice harder for a rougher sound, and some of the cracks in his voice, especially on Moon Above, Sun Below, really do not sound flattering, especially when you know that he could drop it into a death metal growl and it would probably sound better, and he's choosing not to do it. This ties into a larger issue with the production and instrumentation on this album, is that outside of some very solid melodic compositions, there are several moments that seem to directly reference progressive rock and metal acts of the past. Be they Yes, Goblin, Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, King Crimson, or even Steven Wilson's main band Porcupine Tree. And with every single callback, it leaves you wondering what Pale Communion is bringing to the table instead to stand out. It also doesn't help matters that songs like Cusp of Eternity and Voice of Treason are building to some pretty solid grooves that don't really pay off their dramatic crescendos, which then again, you know Opeth can do that from previous albums, and that just becomes all the more frustrating. Now, fortunately, Opeth's songwriting remains very strong, which takes us to lyrics and themes, the latter of which are plainly stated in 3 Latin statements on the cover of the album from 3 different sources. The statements are pretty typical of Opeth themes, the first being a condemnation of how the senselessness of how the modern world is run, the second stating how friends are won by disingenuous flattery where only the truth could do that much more damage, and the last statement, arguably the most perplexing, states, "He grieves truly, he grieves without a witness." Now, all these statements tie into the larger narrative of the album, reflecting a calamity that befalls 2 people, the narrator and a friend. That disaster largely implied to be the death of a girl who which both men may have had a relationship. It's really quite unclear. And then the album proceeds to explore how these men deal with their grief, and ultimately the dissolution of the friendship. The contrast between the situations comes most to light on Moon Above, Sun Below, where the friend seeks all sorts of people to hear his guilt and to garner some degree of sympathy, where the narrator chooses to isolate himself and deal with the death at his own pace. Because for him, that's natural, and he views the friend's method of coping as somewhat shallow and disingenuous. Now, from an outside perspective, the framing on this story is incredibly tricky. After all, it takes some real tact to question the legitimacy of someone else's grief and coping mechanisms without turning into a massive asshole. And you know what, I'll give Opeth credit. They get damn close to nailing that framing. Elysian Woes probably does the most, as it shows the narrator isolating himself even despite some of the support of his friends, because his introversion means he does not want to show vulnerability. In other words, it's a real flaw on his part. And yet, it's not enough. River implies that he could very easily not care, but honestly, that's not the same thing as closure, and he knows that. So he confronts his friend on Voice of Treason. And then on the follow-up track, Faith in Others, it's revealed that that friend was trying to deal with his pain. And while it might not appear as genuine to the narrator, it's very real for the friend. And then the truth comes out of both men. A real anger that reflects both the narrator and his friend. And while the friend reaches out at the end to try and save things, try to salvage that ruined friendship, like melting water, there's nothing that he can really hold on to. And then the narrator manages to gain some version of closure, but he's turned his back on his friend. He's lost that friendship. And while the obvious interpolation of Pink Floyd's Dogs on that track does kind of annoy me, it's a reference that makes complete narrative sense, especially with that tie-back lyric, deaf, dumb, and blind, you keep on pretending that everyone's expendable and no one has a real friend. By assuming the friend's grief and coping mechanism was not genuine, instead choosing to isolate himself, he may have found some version of inner peace, but at the cost of a friend, was it worth it? And you know what? All of that would be great lyrical analysis, except I found an interview from Michael Ackerfeld saying that there was no lyrical theme on this album, and the past bit of this review is just so much pretentious conjecture. Figures, and I have a tendency of doing that. But honestly, it's a little bit of a damn shame, because without that thematic cohesion and narrative, this album feels a little bit weaker. And look, I'm not saying it's bad. Many of the songs do work well as standalone pieces. They work just fine, and there are enough great moments instrumentally and lyrically that work pretty damn effectively for progressive rock and progressive metal. But in the end, for as much as this album calls back to the past, both in terms of other prog rock bands and unintentionally the band's own history, I can't help but feel that Opeth's Pale Communion doesn't look quite as strong in comparison. So I'm thinking a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation for prog and Opeth fans, but there's better both from the genre and from Opeth itself. And while I can appreciate Opeth calling back to the past, Pale Communion, unfortunately, pales in comparison. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know this review was very long in coming, but I wanted to have a chance to talk about them, and this album really took a long time for me to really process. So yeah, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.